Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Christy Arzola, and I release a real-time watercolor lesson every Tuesday at 11 a.m. Denver time. These are the materials that I will be using today. It is often the same materials every week, but you are welcome to pause the video and refer to the video description. Today, we are going to be painting a yellow bird, fluffy and fat, sitting on a branch. I thought it would be a fun subject, and I hope you enjoy the process. In my videos, I never play background music. I want you to be able to play your own music and enjoy the environment, but I am going to take you through this step by step as if you were attending one of my workshops. Also in the video description is a line drawing as well as a reference photo that you can download and print at home. I want you to print the line drawing out at the scale you plan on painting it. If you're comfortable drawing it freehand, you're more than welcome. Once you have the line drawing printed, on the back of the line drawing, you can use a pencil to apply graphite. Position it on top of your watercolor paper so the graphite is in contact with your watercolor paper. Tape it in position, and then use a ballpoint pen to trace any of the details that you feel like would be helpful throughout the painting process. Once you're done, you can just remove that line drawing from your watercolor paper, and we are ready to begin. So to begin, I'm going to start off with mixing some of the paint colors I intend to use for the bird. I'm using a large number 10 round, and I'm getting it wet and allowing the brush to hold as much water as it can possibly hold. And then I'm dragging the brush across the rim of my paint palette so it releases some of that water, creating a small puddle. Now, I don't want to use so much water that my color is completely diluted and not very vibrant. So I'm just going with a small amount of water, but I am going to mix a variety of colors I plan on using for the bird. That way, it's ready to go and makes things easy for you all. So one of the first colors I'm going to use is a lemon yellow. It's a really vibrant yellow. You don't need this exact color. Just use what you have on hand that is close. And once I feel like that paint color might be as vibrant as I'd like, I use a scrap piece of watercolor paper to test out my color. I want to keep in mind that my color will dull and actually lighten up by about 20% when it dries. So you want to mix your colors to be about 20% darker than you intend for them to look in the finished product. The second color I'm going to mix up is a cadmium yellow. This is a warmer yellow, but most of my bird will actually be the cadmium yellow. So I'm going back and forth, adding more and more pigment to my water. When I feel like the color and value is about right, I'm going to do a thorough dump of my brush, drag it across the rim of my palette to remove the excess. And I'm going to test out that color on my scrap piece of paper to make sure it's as vibrant as I'd like. I'm happy with that color, so I'm going to move on to mixing the third color. This third color is going to use cadmium yellow as well, but I'm going to add its complementary color, which would be purple, so I can kind of create more of a golden yellow to use in the shadow areas of the feathers. I'm adding quite a bit of that cadmium yellow because I do want vibrant color. Once I'm happy with that cadmium yellow, then I will be adding the smallest amount of purple light. That is just a nice warm purple versus a cooler purple like the Daxing violet. I'm going to use this warm purple, just a small amount. Don't need anything too much. It will change our yellow color pretty quickly. I just want a nice golden color to use in the shadows of my yellow. Now I'm going to mix up a little bit more of a cooler purple to use in the shadows of any of the white feathers. I'm going to get some of the dioxazine purple with some water. I don't want it too dark. This is a powerful pigment. This is probably too dark. I need to add more water to my mixture to lighten it up. So I'm just using my brush to transfer water from my water cup over to the palette, and I can dilute that color to make a lighter value. And that's more of what I'm looking for. Just something nice and soft, nothing too dark. Now on the next color I'm going to mix up, I'm going to use some Payne's Gray. And I want this Payne's Gray to be more of a black. Cut that color out. And now I am going to be pulling some of this Payne's Gray over into nearby wells. So you'll notice I'm using my brush to pick up some of that Payne's Gray that I've mixed to drop a small amount of it in 2 additional wells. And I'm now going to tint those other Payne's Grays with a little bit more color. So one of them I'm going to tint with an ultramarine blue. So it leans more to the blue side. You can test that color out. You want to get a little bit more blue in there, a bit more vibrant. Like that. Now the black that is near the light source, I want it to be a warmer color. So I'm going to use a little bit of, I'm going to go with a burnt sienna. This is kind of a warm brown. Gray. And that's a good color. I like that. And I think lastly, I'm just going to do a really light watered down gray. I'm going to add a little bit of purple to it just to give it a little tint. Using that dioxazine purple. And there we have it. So if you need to, pause the video while you finish mixing up your paint colors. Otherwise, I'm just going to dive right into making today's bird. The first thing I want to be mindful of is how light the feathers are on this bird, especially on the chest, the underbelly, where I might have some white fur, as well as on the back of the bird, where I have a lot of yellows up against the white background. So if my pencil lines or transfer lines are too dark, they're going to show in the finished product. So I use a kneaded eraser to just tap along any of the lines that would be between light yellow and the background. I don't want those dark pencil lines to show up in the finished piece. The rest of the lines I'm not very worried about at this time. The feet are going to be darker in color. The stripe on the head, parts of the wing, those are all going to include a lot of darker colors. So I'm not too worried about it. Now, before I begin painting, I want to be mindful of any small, delicate white. For example, the reflection in the eye of the bird, if there's any white reflections on the feet. If we have any white that we want to protect in the feather or the wing of the bird that we're fearful we might accidentally cover up. That's where masking fluid comes in. So masking fluid is a liquid. You can get it clear or tinted. It comes in many different brands. And It allows us to keep paint out of specific areas, and we later peel it up with our fingertips, revealing the original white of the paper. Now, this stuff can be rather difficult on your brushes, so I need to get some Dawn dish soap so I can layer some soapy water on my paintbrush so this masking fluid doesn't ruin it. So I've put some Dawn dish soap in a small amount of water in a cup, and I'm going to pick up the brush that I plan on applying the masking fluid with, and I'm just going to really make sure that Dawn dish soap is dissolved in the soapy water. That way, that soapy water can be all over the bristles of my brush, providing a layer of protection. Now I'm going to open up my masking fluid. I'm going to get a little bit on my brush and wipe away the excess. I want to put a little bit in the reflection of the eye. I do want to put a little bit of reflection on the beak. And just to provide myself some peace of mind, I am going to apply some masking fluid in the areas where I would like some of the white feathers to be. Now, although I put a layer of soapy water on my brush to protect it, I have to be mindful that I do still need to rinse my brush frequently to avoid the masking fluid eventually ruining this brush. So I've gone a little ways. Just for peace of mind, I'm going to rinse my brush out really well, and I'll re-dip in my masking fluid and proceed with applying. I'd much rather rinse frequently and not ruin my tools than to get distracted and have to buy new brushes. You can also use a tapered silicone sculpting tool to apply masking fluid. That way you don't have to use a paintbrush and get concerned about it. In order to get nice, thin, narrow lines with my masking fluid, I'm making sure to not overload my brush with too much masking fluid. I wipe away the excess before I come to the painting. I also hold my brush relatively vertical so that I'm able to get these really nice thin lines with less effort. If I hold my paintbrush like I would a pencil or pen when I'm writing a note, the lines are going to be very wide and they're not going to be as narrow as I'd like. So light pressure, keep that brush vertical, and just barely touch the end of your brush to your paper. Been a little while since I've rinsed. So I'm going to re-rinse my brush. Wipe away the excess water. Not going to dry it though. And I'll re-dip in the masking fluid and continue. You can also practice painting thin, narrow lines with your paintbrush by using scrap paper first before you come to painting. A little bit of practice goes a long way when you're first starting out and not used to holding paintbrush. I'm just trying to get nice thin line work in here to apply some of the feathers. I know it doesn't have to be perfect or in the exact location. There's also going to be some whites on the tail of the bird, but rather than masking those whites since they're so minimum, I would actually prefer to mask the edge of the leaf that is in the foreground so I don't accidentally bring my paint gray and other colors into this leaf. Payne's gray and dioxazine purple are two swing pigments. So if I accidentally get them on my face, I will not be able to lift them or read them into the dry. I'm just going to protect that leaf. Been a while since I've rinsed my brush, so I'm going to give it a good rinsing again. Now I'm going to get a little bit more masking fluid, and I want there to be just a few little white, wispy, feather hairs along the edge of this wing. So I'm keeping light pressure and trying to pull my brush away from the paper as I reach the end of the hair texture and feather texture. And we have just a little bit of these wispy feather textures along the chest. Just pausing to kind of make sure that I have all the little wispy feather textures where I want them. I think that's good enough for now. So I'm going to rinse my brush really well in that soapy water. You got the reflection off the eye. All right, so I'm going to get all that masking fluid out of my brush. I want to be really thorough about cleaning it in the soapy water. Once I feel like all the masking fluid is out, I'm going to rinse that soapy water out of my brush so it doesn't affect my paint. All right. So once the brush is clean, we just need to wait a minute or two for the masking fluid to dry. It may already be dry. All right. So I'm now going to be using my large number 10 round to apply a thin amount of water to my bird. My masking fluid is all dry. And I don't need to go right up to the edge, but I want to get nearby. I don't care if my water ends up in the eye or the beak. If a little water drips on your painting, you just use a paper towel to soak it up. In the beginning, I apply a thick layer of water just to make sure it has enough water to absorb into the paper. I don't care if the water hits the lakes. Lakes are much darker. You can put that water right on top of the masking fluid. Don't even worry about it. And extend that water down into the tail of your bird. Be mindful not to touch the branch. Okay, so if I tip my paper, you can see where I have some areas of puddling and other areas where its water is thinner. I want to get rid of the puddles. So I dry my brush on a sponge or paper towel, and I use that dry brush to drag through the thicker areas of water on my painting. And I want to let this water kind of sit a little bit, so it can absorb into the paper. That will give us more control. If we start applying paint too soon in the process, our paint will be diluted in color. It would also be difficult to control where our paint goes. So soak up that excess water and then take a moment to just let that water sit until it began to absorb into the surface of the paper. That's when you're at the happy stage where it's easier to control where your paint colors go.
If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up.
Okay, when I tip my paper, there is definitely less water and less shine, but it is still very wet and glossy. That's the happy stage. Now we can begin adding the paint colors for our bird. So I'm going to grab that lemon yellow. I'm going to wipe away the excess paint by dragging my brush across the rim on the palette. And I'm now going to come in and my goal is just to get a base color on my bird. And being mindful of the bottom belly where I want there to be some white. But since we waited till that happy stage, it's pretty easy to kind of control where your paint goes as long as you wipe away the excess. Now I am going to dip my paint into that cadmium yellow, dragging my brush across the rim to get rid of the excess paint so my brush is only semi-loaded, staying above the wings. I'm getting close to the outside edge, but not going right up against it just yet. Right now, my goal is focused on larger shapes. I want there to be some darker yellows on the underside of the beak, so it kind of looks like shadows. The little blooms I'm getting, where it kind of looks like fireworks, where the color spreads in the water, it adds texture that I absolutely love. So I'm not fighting it. I'm just letting those little happy textures occur and letting them be. Now I've got the majority of my yellow down. I'm going to switch my brush. I'm going to rinse this one out and set this number 10 round on my table. I'm going to grab my number 6 round because it's a little smaller. That way I can add smaller amounts of color and have a little bit more control. So I'm going to grab some of that lemon yellow. Then goes a little bit of paint caught up in my brush from the previous cleaning. I'm just doing a second rinse. All right, so I'm using this lemon yellow and a number 6 round to add some feather texture on the outside edge. So my goal is not to trace the outside edge in one smooth line. My goal is to actually create some feather texture along the outside edge. So I'm kind of creating like little zigzag fluffy feathers that are wider than my bird. I'm going to do this along the back of my bird too, creating some feather texture. And then also do this on the underside of the bird. Not worrying about the butt. Now I am going to rinse the paint out of my brush, and I'm going to use clean water to kind of drop in some clean water into the areas where I want some white feathers on the underbelly of the bird. So if some of our yellows started creeping into that area, you can also clean your brush, dry it off on a sponge, and you can press down with firm pressure in the areas where you want to pick up some of that yellow paint. And it's called blotting, where we kind of remove that excess paint color from the area where we want brighter white. If you need to, you can go in and tap with a clean paper towel. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to find that really, really watered down version of that purple gray color. And I'm going to bring some of that color in for the underbelly. You rinse my brush really good, dry it off. And I can use this practically dry brush to kind of push and pull these colors around, blending them in a way that I like. I notice I'm missing some yellow feathers above that far right eye. I want to grab some cadmium yellow on my number 6 round. I'm just going right into that area to make sure I get yellow on that side of the head. Make sure my cadmium yellow goes right up through the edge of the wing the way I want. And I'm now going to get more of that watered down grayish purple to put on the underside of my bird's tail. I'm going to rinse my brush, get it nice and clean, dry it off, and I can use this clean, practically dry brush to pick up some of the colors and soften them in the areas where I want lighter, softer color. to imply maybe some white feathers. I'm not worried about doing any of the darker blacks at the moment. I don't want them to completely mingle with all my yellows, dulling them. So I'm going to wait a little bit before I do that. But I am going to grab some of that darker golden yellow using my number 6 round. I'm going to get some of that darker color on the underside of the beak, maybe going across the chest of the bird. I also want to get some of that darker golden yellow to be on the underside of the wing so it looks like a shadow. If you want, you can kind of sparingly just create some other additional strokes with that golden yellow, maybe along the shoulder of the bird. So it looks a little bit darker. The back of the eye going straight back to home. But in some areas of my paper, I've lost the gloss completely. So that's a visual cue to me that I have kind of lost time to continue working on this if I want to avoid brush strokes and blooms that I don't intend. So I'm going to rinse my brush, set that aside. I'm going to pause the video so I can hit this with the blow dryer so I can continue working on the bird. Now that everything on the bird is completely dry, I'm going to be able to start adding additional details. So I'm returning to my number 6 round, and I want to get some of the colors into the bird wing that I want. Now I'm going to add just a small amount of clean water onto just the wing where I plan on having all of those darker grays. I'm not worried about going right up to the outside edge of the wing shape. I just want to get a little bit of water in here so I have a chance to get my colors in before they dry. That's a very small amount. I didn't go very far. Now I'm going to get the Payne's Gray that I tinted with the brown. And on the very back edge of the wing, I'm going to add some of this brown color. When I get close to the top edge of the wing, I want to make sure that I create a wispy feather-like texture. Well, again, I don't want to just smooth all that out. I want to create the illusion that there are feathers there. After I have some brown down, I am going to switch to the paint spray that I had tinted with some of the blue. I'm going to wipe away the excess, tap my sponge if I need to so I don't have too much paint on my brush. And right at this top corner near the shoulder of the bird, I'm going to continue with that wispy texture in the wing. Continuing with this blue-gray color around the edge of this wing. making sure to just go right over top of that masking fluid, trusting it'll keep things out. And this is just the first layer of color on that wing. So I'm going to give that some space so it can dry, but I'm going to proceed to the tail to get some color in there. So I'm going to rinse that blue-gray out of my brush. I'm going to grab that lighter, watered down purple gray. And I want to not bring the color up too far. And I'm being mindful of getting that little wispy feather texture so it looks like there's some white feathers on the underside of the tail. And then I can bring some of that kind of purple gray into the rest of the tail, being mindful of where I have white on the tail and not bringing it too far down. Since I have the masking fluid here, I can continue with some of these purple grays right on the end of the tail. And I can come in contact with that leaf without the worry the colors are going to mess up the leaf. I'm going to continue with this light watered down gray purple to get some color on the top of the head. So I'm going to start in the center here and work my way out towards the eye. However, notice that I'm making little small dash marks when I reach the edge of the stripe along the head. That helps it look more like feathers. So I'm just doing more dashed lines rather than, completely filling it in. I'm keeping light pressure and holding my brush more vertical. I'm going to continue with this color to the opposite side of the head, trying to get those thin little dash marks so it looks like feathers. When I get more central on the head, I can play that in really better. Now, once I kind of have that gray purple on the head, I'm going to soak up any excess puddling of paint. And then I'm going to grab that gray with the blue added to just get a little bit of a darker tone through the center of the head. I'm going to rinse my brush and just let that dry. I'm going to get the paint gray that I tinted with the brown, dragging my brush across the rim to get rid of the excess. For those of you that don't use a paintbrush a whole lot and are still practicing your brush control, you might want to switch to a smaller brush because I'm now going to add this brown gray color to the eye. And it's an important feature of the painting, so I don't want it to get too big. So if you would feel more comfortable using a smaller brush, do switch to a smaller brush to give yourself better control and visibility. Now, I've learned the hard way that it is hard to resist making the eye larger and larger in pursuit of perfection when working on animal eye, especially birds. It's easy to just make them larger and larger and larger on accident. So try to resist perfection and expanding the size of your eye because it'll just make things worse. It's okay to have a smaller eye that has imperfection. It will still look great. Now, while those areas with the gray are drying, I'm now going to return to the feathers again and just add some additional texture. So I'm going to get some of that golden yellow that we added the purple to. Still using my number 6, but I'm wiping away the excess really good. I'm even going a step further of doing a light tap on my sponge so I don't have too much paint on my brush. And I'm going to go behind the eye here and just create some wispy feather-like textures behind the eye. I'm going to continue with some wispy little textures for feathers to go along the area of the neck. Underneath that beak, again, I want there to be some darker feather textures that should be in shadow. But notice the negative space that I'm leaving in between the brush strokes. And not all my feather texture and line work is evenly spaced. I'm trying to add some variation in my shapes and line length to add some interest. I don't want to create a pattern on accident. I'm going to also go along the center chest area of the bird just to add a little bit more value with that golden yellow. I can add more sparing texture marks towards the right edge of the bird, just not being real heavy-handed because I don't want to cover up all the light yellows I've created. The underside of the wing, I can add just a little bit more of that golden yellow. And just being mindful not to come in contact with any wet areas where my grades might still be wet. Adding some darker yellows on the underside of the bird. Not worrying about going on top of the feet. Feet are such a darker color that I'll be able to cover that up pretty easily. Continuing with my little wispy textures near the underside of the wing and being a little more sparing through the belly of the bird. And then along the back of the bird, I'm going to add some additional texture with that golden yellow also. In between the eye and the beak, I'm going to add some darker golden yellows on the back side of the beak as well. I'm going to rinse my brush really good. Dab my sponge to get rid of some of that excess water so I don't dilute my paint color. I'm going to get some of that cadmium yellow on my brush, but I'm going to wipe away the excess and do a light tap on my sponge so I have more success with creating thin line work. If I load my brush with too much paint, then all my line works will be really wide. Continuing with that cadmium yellow, just to add some feather texture and darken the values where I want them. Trying to let some of the areas where we have brighter yellows that are softer in value, trying to let those still shine. You don't want to go dark everywhere. I'm going to rinse all the yellow out of my brush and tap my sponge to get rid of that water. I'm going to dip my brush into that really watered down light gray and purple. And again, making sure my brush doesn't have too much paint on it. I want to continue with the feather texture. And I'm going to create some wispy little lines on the underbelly of my bird. And continue with this gray purple on the tail. Trying to just darken up some areas. Okay, so I am going to give the bird a break, let some of those layers dry, and I'm now going to focus my attention more on the leaves. So with that in mind, I need to mix up a couple variations of green. So I'm going to return to my number 10 round. I'm going to use my number 10 to carry as much clean water over to the palette as it can. And I don't want my colors to be too diluted. So I'm just adding a small amount of water to my paint palette. Now, sap green is going to be my base green for these leaves. But I want one variation of the sap green to be more of a lime green color, whereas the second variation of the sap green, I want it to be a cooler green with a little bit of added blue. Right now, I'm just making sure I add plenty of green paint to both so I can get the darkest version of this sap green if possible. And anytime I'm in doubt where I'm at value-wise, just test my color out on a scrap piece of paper. That's about as dark as Payne's Gray gets. So now I'm going to rinse my brush really well, get all that green out. And I'm going to dip my brush in lemon yellow. I'm going to add lemon yellow to just one of the greens, brighten it up. You might have to do that a few times to make the change in the color the way I want. Once I'm happy with my lime green, I'm then going to switch to adding a small amount of the ultramarine blue, kind of a dark navy blue, in my second green. I'm going to test out my colors, make sure they are what I want. Once I'm happy with them, I'm nearly ready to begin painting the leaves. Now, on these leaves, I would like there to be a nice thin area down the center of the leaf that is a yellow vein. So this requires use of the masking fluid again. So I'm switching back to a small brush. I am actually going to switch to my script liner brush or rigger brush. This is the number 1. And it's just going to help me get a little bit more of a narrow line. So number 1 rigger. Otherwise, just use the smallest brush you have. So add that layer of soapy water to protect whichever brush you're working with. And we are going to apply this masking fluid through the center of each leaf so we can have a yellow vein later. You just have to be really mindful that you don't overload your brush with too much masking fluid or press down too hard while applying it. It's really easy to put too much and to have a really wide line when you need a narrow line. And this is optional. You can also just go without this step. Your leaves are still going to look like leaves even if you don't have this. Now, for myself, I have to kind of rotate my painting, so I'm sorry about that. Just so my hand can reach proper angles. Now, in between each leaf, I am re-rinsing in my soapy water, getting that excess water out before dipping again in my masking fluid. Oops, I'm too white on that. So when that dries, I can just erase it and reapply. So anytime you are applying masking fluid and you have a little whoops, don't let it, ruin your day. Just wait for it to dry and then you can lift it with your hand before you paint and reapply. Re-rinsing in my soapy water, protect my brush. And I'm just kind of rotating my paper so that it's at a more natural angle for when I paint these veins. If any of your pencil lines seem a little dark from your transfer, you can lighten them up before you add your masking fluid.
If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up.
The masking fluid on this leaf where it didn't quite go as planned, and it's a little thick for my taste, I can just take my finger and with firm pressure, rub back and forth over that dry masking fluid, and it's going to peel it right up. You can use a rubber cement pickup too. A rubber cement pickup is just a rubber block. You can use it like an eraser right on top of where you might have had masking fluid just to lift it up. Now I have the chance to reapply the masking fluid and have a second go at it. I'm rinsing all that masking fluid out of my brush really well. Once I'm confident that it's all gone, I'm going to re-rinse the soap out of the brush and set it flat on the table so the brush doesn't get bent out of shape. Now I'm going to use my number 6 round to paint these leaves. If you're concerned about any of the line work being too dark, now's the time to lightly tap a kneaded eraser on the outside edges of some of your leaves. Lighten it up a bit. All right, since I'm right-handed, I'm going to start with painting the leaf on the left. I'm going to start with just a thin amount of water in the shape of the leaf. I'm not worried about going right up to the edge. I want it to be a nice thin amount, no puddles. I need to give it a second or two to absorb in the paper I can. And also just add a little bit of water to a couple leaves at a time. That way the first leaf has a time to absorb that water. No puddles. That'll make it hard for us to control where paint goes. So if I tip my paper, you can see how much water I used. So not too much, right? I'm at that happy stage. I'm now going to start with that lime green in the far left petal. Just like I did with the bird feathers, I want there to be some texture on the outside edge of this leaf. I'm kind of using the very tip of my round brush to create some texture on the outside edge of the leaf rather than having it be perfectly smooth. I'm now going to use some of that blue green through the center of my leaf and the upper edge. I want more shadows. Still using the very end of my round brush to create the absolute most subtle little texture. If I want additional texture in there while it's wet, I can come in with my round brush and I can tap my brush so it releases some of that color just so it looks a little bit more interesting with the value. So I'm going to return to the next leaf, making sure there's a thin amount of water, but not so much that it's puddling. I'm going to use my lime green first. Using the very end of my brush to go towards the outside edge of the leaf, creating that little zigzag texture that I want these leaves to have. When I get towards the top of the leaf where I want some shadows, I switch to my darker green. I'm going to rotate the painting a little bit and have a better angle for my hand. Trying to get that little texture on the outside edge, even with my dark green. Once I'm happy with that, I just move on to the next one. When I get toward the top, I'll switch to that dark green and want some darker color. If I have another leaf that is still wet, I can use my brush to kind of tap in some darker color and texture while I have it wet. Filling out of water. Maybe it's few leaves that I'm working on. Now there are two leaves overlapping one another here. I can only paint one at a time. You have to let one of them dry completely before painting the second one nearby. Making sure there's no puddles of water, I can start with my lime green. And switch to my dark green and I start getting to the top. The second leaf, the water has begun to absorb it in the paper nicely. So it's that perfect sheen that I want, not too wet, but not super glossy. So it's at that happy stage. Start with that lime green, getting that textured outside edge. Rotate my painting to give me better access to certain angles. Once I reach more of the top, I'm going to switch to the darker green. I can just tap my brush so it releases more of that dark green in the areas that I want it. Now I have to skip the leaf that it's overlapping. I have to move to look narrowly that. I want to absorb any excess water, really thin it out, not too wet. And this leaf is mostly dark green, so that's what I'm going to use to paint it. Since this is a much more of a side angle, not much of the leaf texture that you see. We have another leaf that is behind that we need to skip. So I'm just going to hop up to the top leaf to look next. Adding some clean water. Don't want any puddles of heat. I'm soaking up all the excess water. You thin it out. pretty into my wine green. Wet leaf. And grab some of that dark green and tap some of that into the leaf. There's 2 leaves overlapping near the bird, and you have to paint one at a time. And flip and flip and finger the leaf. Try not to paint on top of the feathers. Try to go around them. Okay, so while those leaves are drying, I'm going to return to the bird to add some additional details. I want to brighten up the beak of the bird, so I'm going to use some yellow and cadmium orange. And I want to just get a first layer in this beak. Not worried about the crease between the top and bottom part of the beak. I'm just kind of going around that outside edge with this cadmium orange. And the beak is another thing where it's really easy to make it bigger and bigger and bigger when you feel like it's not perfect. So just be really careful about that. Sometimes it's just not worth continuing to fix edges if it means making your beak larger and larger. I'm going to switch to my really small brush. I'm going to get some cadmium red pale hue. I want to darken up parts of the top of the beak and put the underside of the beak. If I need to, I can rinse my brush and get the water out of it. And with a fairly damp brush, I can kind of blend these colors on the beak when it's damp. And I just need to give that time to dry. I'm now going to get my darker paint gray mixture, being mindful not to rest my hand in any of the wet leaves. If you're concerned about it, you can always dry them with your blow dryer. But I'm going to use this darker Payne's Gray on the top of the bird's head, and I'm going to darken up some of the feathers. Still using little dashed lines so it looks like feather texture. Try not to smooth it out too much. Letting that first layer of color kind of shine through in between the feathers. I can also use this darker Payne's gray to darken up parts of the bird's eye. I can leave the underside of the bird's eye to be a little whiter, more brown in color. I'm going to darken up that top portion. I'm also going to darken up part of the eye on the back wall as well. The beak is still damp. I can't do anything in there until that completely dries, but I can continue to push some of my darks on the side feathers of the wing. And we can just use little dash lines going in the direction of the feathers. Because we put that masking fluid there, we don't have to really worry about hitting the areas where we want white in our feather. They're protected. So it gives us a chance to kind of play with textures more freely and not worry about accidentally hitting those areas. Continuing with that darker Payne's gray, I'm going to push some of the colors on the tail to be a little darker in a few areas. Use this darker Payne's gray just to push some of that feather texture on the underside of the belly. Now, around a bird's eye, there are very subtle little scales that surround the eye. They can be very difficult to paint, so if you like your eye as it is now, this is not a necessary step. Sometimes less is more. But if you're up to the challenge, get the smallest brush you have. Make sure it is not loaded with too much paint, so you wipe away the excess. And you can go around the outside edge of the eye, kind of creating this circular pattern of small tiny dots. Now, if you're tempted to keep doing more, I would just pause, really move slowly, use very, very light pressure. and add some little scales or lashes on the opposite eye if you want. There's some areas on feathers where you want them to be pushed to a darker black. Just do a third layer. Use gray. Once that beak is completely dry, you can come in with some of that darker Payne's gray, a very, very light touch. And you can establish the crease that is in between the top and bottom half of the beak. I'm going to return to my leaves and paint the leaves I had to skip due to the overlap. I'm returning to my number 6 round. And add a small amount of water to the leaf first, making sure to soak up any puddling of water before I begin painting. And this will be the same technique we did before. I can tap my brush to release more paint because it's not as dark as I'd like. And I'm going to grab some that darker green as well. And move on to the next leaf. I play day narrow. Anytime a leaf is further away, you see less details on it. Really up to you if you want to try and create that little sawtooth edge with the leaf. If you do it though, you just do ever so slightly and put you good with it. All right, now it's time to proceed with the branch, but I need to remove masking fluid from parts of the bird As long as everything is completely dry, it's safe to do so without smearing the paint. So I'm going to use my rubber cement pickup. I'm not worried about the masking fluid in the vein areas of the leaf. I'm just focused on this one leaf that we still have yet to paint. As long as all the black paint in the wing is dry, move the masking fluid from the wing. You'll have the opportunity to still add additional paint after you remove the masking fluid if you feel like the masking fluid was a little too white. Remove the masking fluid from the beak and the eye reflection. I can use my small number 2 round with that dark haze gray to add any additional black if I feel like my white got a little long.
If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up.
Also, will add additional details on the wall. I can use some of that watered down purple gray to add just a little bit of color to the back, bird's feathers. You can use the same watered down purple gray for the feathers that are in shadow under the wing. And continue with this purple gray and belly of the bird, not quite a lot. You have more of that golden yellow and underside. Beak. I feel like it needs a bit darker still. All right, so now I'm going to paint the leaf that was skipped because of the bird's tail. Adding a thin amount of water first. Making sure there's no puddle. And that little sawtooth edge from leaving the very end of my round brush. I can rotate my painting to make it easier for me to reach those angles. I forgot about the little yellow vein through the center of the leaf, but I'm not going to worry about it. Add a little bit of darker green. I'm going to let that leaf dry. Now I need to make more palette space for the branch colors. So I'm going to get a second palette. Now that I have a second palette, I'm going to mix up colors for the branch. Just like I did for the bird, I'm going to put a small amount of water in a few areas of the palette. You can just mix up some colors. We only need a tiny bit of water. The branch isn't exactly a large part of my painting. So the first color I'm going to mix up is going to utilize some of that green that we had previously. So I'm just going to pull some of that green using my number 10 large brush. And I pulled some of it aside in a new area of my palette. In the other, I have a little bit of water. And I'm going to add just the smallest amount of that cadmium red to make it more of an olive color. This is that green with added cadmium red tail, so it's a little bit more of an olive tone. I also want to use some of that burnt sienna. I'm going to use some burnt umber. And I want my burnt umber to not be a straight brown. I want it to have a little bit of a green hue to it. I'm going to add some green. Then I'm going to pull some of that brown-green mixture aside and add a little blue for in the shadows of the branch. All right, so we have the olive green. We've got a little bit more of a darker brown with that added blue for in our shadows. We have some of the burnt sienna. We add a little bit more of that beak and add some burnt umber to it just to darken it up a bit. More color. So go ahead and pause the video if you need to while you mix up your colors. Again, this is the olive green with added dark blue. This is just the olive green, and then this is that burnt umber and burnt sienna mixture. Now, as I paint my branch, I don't want to accidentally hit the feet of my bird. So I'm just going to be mindful of that. If I need to redraw those bird feet so I know where not to go with my water and paint, I can do that before beginning the branch. I'm just going to paint this branch in little segments. I'm adding a little bit of water first. But I'm not forcing myself to bring the water perfectly up to the pencil edge. And I'm stopping before I get to the feet. Before I introduce color, I want to soak up any puddling of water. Nice and thin. And I'm going to switch to my smaller number 2 round. I'm going to get that olive color green. I'm just going along the very top edge of my branch. I don't feel the need to fill everything in perfectly. I'm going to allow the textures and blooms. When I get to the foot of the bird, I'm going to be very mindful of it and stop before. Now on the other underside of the branch, I want more of a shadow. So I'm going to use that darker olive green that I added that blue to. I'm hopping over the leaf anytime I come into contact with them. I'm very careful not to hit the leaf with my feet, as much as possible. I can use some of this olive green and to tap in some additional textures. So this is the olive green with that brown added in. But notice how I'm okay with leaving some of the white paper midway on the branch because it kind of adds a nice highlight. I'm going to grab some of that darker green where we added the blue to it and just darken up parts of the bottom section of the branch. I'm going to grab a little bit of the lime green from our leaves. And I'm just going to create a branch that connects from the little leaves to the tree branch itself. So that's just layer 1 of that section of the branch. I'm going to continue on to the next area. I want to make sure there's a small amount of water, about puddles, on the branch, and I'm hopping over the feet. I don't touch the feet with the water. I get rid of any puddling water. That makes it very hard to control where our paint goes. And get that olive green with the added brown. I'm going to continue along the top of the branch. When I reach the foot, and hop over it to the opposite side. I'm okay with having a wobbly, imperfect line on the top edge of my branch. I'm going to get that darker olive green with the added dark blue to the bottom of the branch. And when I encounter the heat, I hop over them just like I do the other. What? I can use a little bit of a damp brush to kind of push and pull the color around and blend it. A bit of pockets of dry. I forgot. I want to go around the toe with the bird. All right, so now everything is damp. Some areas are dry, some areas are still drying. But that gives us this really wonderful, unpredictable surface to work on where we can tap our brush with different colors and it's going to create little blooms and textures that just kind of add interest to the branch. So I'm using that dark olive green color with the added blue just to kind of tap in some additional color underneath the bird where it's creating a shadow. And if I encounter dry paper, I'm okay with it. On the underside of the branch, I can continue with this dark olive green with the blue, just to give a little bit more contrast. I recommend dabbing your brush and tapping it so it's not always this perfect line. Give it some texture and some irregularity. Sometimes little dots and dashes are helpful, so it just kind of gives this bark-like texture. I'm going to get some of that brown and burnt little mixture. Don't need it to be too dark, so water it down a little bit. And I can use this color to add to the bark texture. Maybe create a knot, maybe where the leaves are coming out of the branch. Now, while that branch is drying, I can now take a moment to remove the masking fluid from the leaf. I just don't want to accidentally run into the wet branch. So if there's any doubt that I might hit it, I just give it some distance. This is where we discover whether or not our masking fluid application needs a little bit more practice. The love-hate relationship with masking fluid, but once you get it down, you realize how beneficial and helpful it can be as a tool when you're painting. Just be patient with yourself and me. All right, I'm a little nervous about my branch still being wet in some areas, so I'm going to hit that with the blow dryer so I can confidently remove the rest of my masking fluid. Okay, so I've dried the branch and removed the rest of my masking fluid. And I'm now going to use a square brush to lift out a thin line so I can put a vein into this leaf I accidentally didn't include. So I'm using a square brush. This is a relatively stiff brush that I just got wet. And I take my fingers across the metal ferrule to remove the little droplet. And I'm now going to take my square brush to the center of this leaf. And I barely apply any pressure so I can keep the line nice and narrow. And by just dragging my wet brush along the center where I want that vein to be, since the paint colors I'm using are non-theming, it's removing that green paint. But it takes a lot of practice to remove a thin, narrow line like this. You just have to be light-handed and make it your goal to barely bend the bristles of the brush. And that's how you'll get a nice, thin, narrow area. Okay. So now that I've done that, I can use my small number 2 round and I can add some lemon yellow to that center vein. So I am going to come through with my small number 2 round and I'm just going to add lemon yellow down the center of each leaf. I'm going to use a little bit more of that olive green just to darken up some of the branches that connect to the leaves. They're a little bit more visible. Now I'm going to work on the bird's feet. So I'm going to use that brown and burnt sienna mixture that I have made up for the branch. And I just want to do a single layer on each leg. I'm not worried about details just yet. I just want to kind of give a base color. Right now they look like little cartoon feet. That's okay. You should have 3 toes on the front. I'm going to do 1 on the back. So I have to hit these feet with the blow dryer just so I can get to some of the details of the scales on the feet. Now I'm going to use that darker version of that brown and burnt sienna mixture, wiping away the excess off my brush. And just want to kind of follow the contour of the foot with little curved lines so you can kind of see the contour of each toe. Just doing little semi-curved lines. If you need to kind of draw a line in between each toe to help you can start with that as well. Once you kind of created some scales on the toes of your bird, we're now going to add the claws and nails to the end of each toe. You'll need a really dark paint spray, and you'll need a very small brush that you're confident you can get small lines with. Because we want to come to the end of each toe and create a little bird paw. And just like the bird eyes and beak, if you keep working on the claws with the goal of making them absolutely perfect, you will eventually just make them larger and larger. You have to try and ask yourself, is it worth the risk? If I have some details on the feet of my bird that I would love to kind of adjust, but I know from experience, I just have to kind of accept them for what they are. If I don't want them to get larger and larger. But I am going to come in with a little bit of paint spray just to give a little bit more clear definition between each toe. I also want to add a little bit of a shadow on the underside of the foot where it lets on the branch. I'm going to use that dark olive green to push some of those shadows up the branch. All right. So I'm just going to take a little moment to see if there's anything else I want to do to this. You can continue glazing to push your values and details on the leaves if you wish, but ultimately, we have the essentials established. I hope you learned a lot from this tutorial and happy painting. Just keep practicing.